if I can just continue on with the schools issue. I know we spent a little bit of time last week in a school. The debate didn't necessarily focus on schools, however, or education in the city. What's your assessment of Quincy's educational system? Where do you think it could be better? How, as the head of the school committee, de facto or not, would you try to steer the Quincy School Department?
Sure. First and foremost, I view the role as the chairman of the school committee. Obviously, the mayor controls the purse strings. I mean, he decides on the budget. Education, education, public safety, I would say, as far as government goes, are your two priorities. So obviously, you want to provide as many resources as you possibly can for the school system. We have a very extensive administrative team in our school department with some tremendous background. Under ed reform, we've got a lot of principals with more power than they used to have. I would fight for as much as I possibly can to affect that child in the classroom as far as resources go, whether that's getting the building squared away, which I think is an issue, and can continue to be an issue in this campaign. The previous administration, under Gene Creedon's leadership, as well as Jim Sheets, went down the road of smaller class sizes. This mayor's continued that. I would absolutely continue that. I think that's very important. It's those day-to-day things that I hear are problematic, and I'll probably get into this a little bit, but the long-term planning and then the day-to-day stuff. We seem to do everything, not everything, but much of what we do seems to be crisis management. I heard from a number of teachers, they had no copy paper for 2 weeks at the start of school. Where's the breakdown in that? That's something, school's opening, that should happen automatically. Whether it's books, I heard that in the science department at North, they didn't have their textbooks for several weeks. That shouldn't happen. Those are administrative functions, management functions that automatically should happen. The flip side is the long-term planning, which I don't think we do well in general in government, applies to the schools as well. We're starting to have a problem again. I know Atlantic is busting at the seams. Beechwood Knoll School is the 5th grade particularly is busting at the seams because it seems to be a popular school, whatever the case may be. The fact is we've got to do some long-term planning for space needs. The educational demands set down by the state have changed some of those requirements on what you need for space for special programs or per student, and we've got to address that long-term. The other area that concerns me a little bit, the goals program is a pretty good program, but I hear from educators frequently is sometimes the kids that really don't want to behave too well in the classroom have a disruptive effect on the classroom and others' ability to learn in that room. I'd like to see us look at that a little bit more, perhaps be a little tougher on that. Well, and I'd like to sit with the educators to determine what the outcome of that would be. I've heard people suggest that perhaps we should have an alternative learning environment for those folks that can't seem to fit in with the average kid in the class and behave themselves. And if they do that and do well, they get to bump back into the learning environment where they were. Somebody was talking to me recently about that. It has some merit, common sense. It seems to make some sense to me. Those are the kinds of things we should be putting on the table. But the space needs is something long term. I've heard from folks at Bernazani, there's a band practice in one half of the room, and they're trying to teach some special ed kid in the other half of the room. I've heard at Montclair, same thing when you have some individual tutoring. They're in a closet because they're not coordinating the allocation of space and classroom space appropriately. So we have to look at the long term and make sure that we're providing the best environment for the kids for many, many years to come. We're sitting on a school out on East Squantum Street, the old Miles Standard School, that could perhaps be used in the near future for classroom space to address some of these needs as far as space goes. I mean, the governor's talking about, we just went to full day kindergarten. The governor's talking about pre-K now to be an extensive part of what the cities and towns should be doing. So we've got to be addressing those long-term needs before we can even attempt to deal with that. There's also been great discussion about extending the school year, extending the day There's a lot of contractual issues involved with that, but there's also building issues involved with that. You know, most of our buildings are not air conditioned. Imagine going later in the year with no air conditioning. There are, you know, common sense issues we have to deal with as we look at these new educational approaches.
And staying on the schools just for a bit more, you mentioned contractual issues. Very divisive last year, contract negotiations. I don't think it's unfair to say repercussions remain in terms of sentiment of the teachers still working in the schools toward the city, for lack of a better general phrase. Would you have, one, approach those negotiations differently, and two, specifically on the issue of healthcare and other remuneration, how would you have presented what you thought the city should get out of these contract negotiations?
Sure. Let me say a couple of things. Let me go back, contrast what happened this year to my involvement in the early 90s when I was executive secretary and part of that previous administration. And many forget, I mean, it's not that long ago, but when I was executive secretary serving under then Mayor Jim Sheets, his first budget he was creating, we faced a $14 million revenue shortfall. There were two big reasons for that. One is the MWRA was coming into existence. The previous year, Frank McCauley could not get the sewer fee passed with the council because the council saw him sitting on a $10 million surplus, therefore they want to know what you're going to do with that money before we pass this new fee. The fact is, because of the sewer fee and because of the health insurance, which was going out of control at that time, ironically enough, those were the two big ticket items that were knocking the budget out of whack. So the first two things that happened, one was the sewer fee was established quickly by the council, and the second part was we began negotiations with all the unions. Now, I'll tell you right up front, I never had any dealings directly with the teachers union. I did have dealings with the public safety unions and the laborers union on the issue. And the fact is, I think there were 12 carriers that the city had worked with, including Blue Cross and all the various. And we sat as a group for 18 months, providing information, providing the leadership, providing experts on what we could be doing as a city. And with everybody working together at the table, in 18 months, the unions, administration, the leadership, came up with a new program. It was one carrier, Harvard Pilgrim. We saved $3 million that first year. I think it contrasts greatly with the style of leadership that we've seen this mayor, which went to the table. In fact, let me back up. In January, because these were his words, in January he said, before the city council, the State of the City address, that health insurance costs for our employees are the biggest budget buster and have been for the past 5 years. So the first question is, well, what have you done about it for the last 5 years? You had a contract a few years ago and never went on the table. You never brought the Insurance Advisory Committee together to address it. And that was, the Insurance Advisory Committee was the group that we worked with to make those changes in the early 90s. So now, again, it's an example of crisis management, waiting till that point of a crisis to deal with it. And I don't think we make good decisions when that happens. In the case of the strike, it's easy to be a Monday morning quarterback. But my style of leadership, I don't think it ever would have come to that. We would have been at the table on a regular basis earlier on. The mayor indicated he couldn't sit at the table because he's a brother who's a teacher. Yet when it hit the fan, the fact is he was doing the negotiating in the press, both through the print media as well as the TV stations. So you can't have it both ways. And all the while, in my opinion, he was vilifying the teachers. There seemed to be silence on the other side about the superior officer's contract. He's going to make the argument that I'm fighting for the taxpayer, therefore we've got to hold the line. He didn't hold the line on the superior officers. In fact, they got one heck of a deal. And I'm not criticizing them. If I was sitting at the table, I'd have taken the deal too. If you're going to be consistent with how you deal with the unions and address them on these items, particularly health care and raises, then I think you have to be consistent across the board. And that hasn't happened, and I think that was the reason we ended up with the strike. Do I believe the employees are going to have to pay more for health insurance? Absolutely, yes. Times are changing. But the fact is you have to respect that they have those benefits because they negotiated in good faith and bargained for those during many years prior.